Much. All right, well, now that I'm blinded by the pure light of phenomenology,
Right.
it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ferrarello, who's coming to us from CSU East Bay, who also with an appointment at Saybrook University. We've got to say, it's been a lot of fun talking already today. There's not a lot of Husserlians around.
Yeah,
It's a small group,
absolutely.
you know, but there's some of us out there.
Yeah.
And we were sharing stories. Could I tell this story? It's always fun to hear
Yeah,
stories about Husserl too. And the one I heard today is when he would meet you, he had an interest in your buttons. I don't know if he would reach over and grab the buttons or just.
Talk to you very close by and open and close
So
the
I heard
button.
phenomenological discussion. I don't know if that would fly today, but it's interesting.
Renata Refero. I cannot vouch, but that's what I've been.
Yeah, it's fun anyway to think about. And well, Dr. Ferrarello has published extensively, I think 10 books, 5 edited volumes, and multiple papers, including a really cool one on Husserl and Stoicism, covering a wide range of topics. So a real expert in the field, has been at 2 of, I don't know how many, there's maybe 5 Husserl archives, and has studied with many of the great experts in the field, and is now a major contributor herself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ferrarello, who will be talking to us today about the problem of idealization in empathy and ethics.
Thank you. Well, thanks for this invitation, and thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon. I do appreciate it. So what are we going to talk about today? I'll try to create a bridge between empathy and professionalism. So how do we treat empathy in our professional life and in our ethical life? As Jeffrey said, I'm going to be heavily influenced by Husserl's phenomenology. So I'm going to look at this phenomenon from Husserlian lenses. I'm going to take on his criticism against a certain way of interpreting ethics, science, technology. So I'll help you, look into Husserl's sources and navigate these topics. Let's see. In doing that, I will use the mix of 2 books. One is this edited book, Excellent Contributions. By the way, all my books, all the edited books I created, my books, I don't know for what reason, they are all on pirate websites. For my great joy. So this is very easily accessible to, just in case, to Library Genesis. It's really great contributions in this book and in these other books, The Ethics of Love. So from that book, I will take the notion of the problem of what is empathy, how it relates to ethics, and so on. From this book, instead, I will take the perspective of criticizing how we tend to love each other. There's this saying for which no matter the results, if you love someone, it will arrive. It's always good if you love someone, no matter how you get there. And if you look at it from, a psychological, a human perspective, I think we can do better than that. I think we can train our ability to love in the same way as we train our ability to think. So in this book, I created a parallelism. Well, I followed the Husserl's parallelism between ethics and logic. Like logic is the discipline that teach you or train you to think better and better. Ethics could be the discipline that train you to make wiser and wiser choices in matter of love. So in with the combination of these 2 books, in this talk, I will examine how we are using empathy in our professional life, and how and if we can do a better job. So let's start from Husserl. The natural aptitude, what is it? We saw in his ideas six, in the Cartesian meditations in general, but in particular in the sixth Cartesian meditation, Husserl distinguishes the natural attitude from the phenomenological or reflective attitude. What is the natural attitude? Is the attitude in which you live, basically, when you experience life, where you are part of life, you don't stop and reflect on what you're doing. I mean, you can do it every now and then, but then you will engage in a reflective, if you want, a philosophical attitude. The natural attitude is the attitude in which you just live and you give for granted that there's a world outside you with which you can interact, with which you can, do experiences. So this natural attitude is an attitude in which we don't ask ourselves many questions. We just live. And we give for granted that a world is outside there. How do we call this world? Reality, irreality, illusion, my perception. That starts creating a difficulty. So much so that he writes here, reality and irreality often belongs to each other. When I try to answer the question, what is reality, I inevitably go back to the subjectivity and I try to understand within the lived experience of this subject what is real and what is not. Curious that in German we have two terms to indicate reality, real and real, where the first one is the reality as it is meant by the subject, and the second one is the reality that is outside. So even when we are in the natural attitude, if you stop someone and saying, hey, I don't see the same fountain of gold that you're seeing, what are you talking about? Then you have to create a discussion about what you are seeing and if I'm seeing the same thing. And this creates a longer discussion in psychology, but we leave it there. Now, why do we want to investigate the role of natural attitude? Because in the crisis of European sciences, Husserl noticed how our idea of science grew on a view of self that is mostly based on the natural attitude. So in this world, we give for granted that a self exists independently of us, that this self is a kind of an abstraction of a model of an ideal. Here, Husserl uses the word idea in a kind of a Platonic sense, eidos. Eidos come from the Greek orao to say what I've seen. It's the past of orao. So orao means to see, to watch. So the idea is what I've seen and remains there as a construction. So in this natural attitude, we need constructions, we need ideas, models, because it takes a long time to live. I mean, I don't know how many of you had the experience of changing country, moving to a place where everything is new. I remember when I arrived in the US, I was completely overwhelmed by the amount of milk I could choose, oh God, I could choose from in the supermarket. And I realized that at the end of the day, every day I was extremely tired. I couldn't understand why at the beginning. That I realized that, my natural attitude was constantly interrupted by reflections. I didn't have as many constructions, as many ideas, as many natural pebbles to walk on, because, everything was new. So we actually need ideas, we need these constructions to live. our normal life, to conduct a healthy natural life. The problem is that we cannot forget that there's the human being. We cannot forget that there's wow, that there's a what is this?
I think it's the heating system.
Okay, well, it's doing some good. Okay, it's doing some good to us. All right. So we can't forget that there is a double direction in in this way of living the world. There's the direction of I'm living, I don't ask questions, I don't reflect, I use these constructions just to survive. But we cannot forget that these constructions, these ideas come from the sense I made of them. Because now I know that every time I go to a supermarket, there are 1 million kinds of milk to choose from. And I don't ask myself any questions. And okay, I know what my favorite is. But I know that originally I had to take lots of time to decide what's the best choice. There was the human being, Susi, who was lost in front of that aisle to make a choice. What's the problem here, to come back to science? Husserl here is criticizing Galileo's model of doing science. Now, Galileo had his reasons. Galileo wrote Il Saggiatore when he was trying to find, you know, we don't forget that Bruno was burnt alive because he was going against the word of the church. So he was trying to find a diplomatic way to speak to the church and to emancipate the science from the Bible. Because up to that moment, the word for any kind of more knowledge, from medicine to law to geography, was dictated by the Bible. So what Galilei tried to do was to prove that one thing is what talks about the spirit. Another thing is what expresses the language of nature. Nature talks about, talks through its own language. And this language is mostly a mathematical and geometrical language. So the idealization, the knowledge we have about nature, according to Galileo, is mostly geometrical and numerical. And it is separated from the spiritual knowledge, because the spiritual knowledge belongs to the church. We leave you. All that has to do with the spirit. You are the maximum authority. We scientists want to work on nature. To do that, we will use an instrument that is completely different. It's barely human because it uses numbers and it uses geometrical forms. That's where Husserl's notion of idealization becomes very critical of a certain notion, a certain idea of science. Because while for Husserl, measurement means to invenio, to find something, to discover what is there and produce meaning for it, for Galileo, measurement becomes a way to let nature speak itself. So the number is the nature itself, this object that speaks through its own voice. It's the natural attitude. It's an idealization that is completely detached from the person who invenio, who finds this meaning, who finds this piece of reality, and is there. It's almost unquestionable. It's universal. That kind of science, Husserl says, it's quite dangerous because it separates the object of science from the meaning-giving subject. We find a token, and then we forget who is behind that token. This token becomes a universal truth. And here I created a little diagram to give the sense of how Husserl thinks of the constitution of sense. So it's not that he's saying the world of science, the objective world is subjective. It's not that radical. He believes that there are abstractions, idealization, formalizations that do not need the subjects to be there. I mean, if I use a number to indicate, I don't know how many women stop breastfeeding after 3 months, I'm using a datum that is universally applicable. It's something, it's an abstraction, it's reliable, and so on. But I arrived at that datum through subjective investigation, meaning I asked a certain number of people, when did they stop? And most probably, I decided to arrive at that question because I, as a subject, was interested in that topic. So what it's saying is that when we make sense of something, we start from a living body. Again, very nice, German has 2 words to describe the body, Leib and Körper. So Leib is the living body. It's the body of sensations, feelings. It's all that makes us alive. While Körper is the organic matter, is the body as it is influenced by, you know, this flow of life. So here Husserl says, when I start making sense of life, from the smallest thing of choosing your milk to the highest example of finding meaning in your job, you start with the tactile sensations of your body, of feeling your presence in this world. And through these kinesthetic sensations, you have what he defines a double apprehension, meaning you perceive yourself, but in perceiving yourself, you perceive yourself as different from others. So there's always this very immediate but essential step that leads, that opens, if you want, a solipsism to intersubjectivity. When I perceive my body, even my body is something other than the sensation I'm having in this moment. And from this body, I can perceive other bodies. I can see other bodies. And the presence of these other bodies open to an empathetic perception. So I realize that there are that I'm not in a world that has no windows and doors, but I'm in an intersubjective community where I can talk to others, I can have interaffective connections, I can create a community. Then from this community, I know that I can bring my own talent, that I can develop my interests, my motivations, my intentions. Then I can create abstractions out of what I'm feeling. I can produce a scientific work that can be as universal as I try to make it. I would use the word general rather than universal, but sometimes science aims at universality. So this is the direction of the arrow. We can't forget that there's a human being at some point creating this directionality. If we forget that, it's a big problem. It's a huge problem. Personally, because you disconnect from yourself as a human being, you experience, you know, a loss of sense in your personal life. You might encounter depression or I don't know, alternate moods and so on. And from a scientific work-life perspective, it might lead to a situation in which science does not take into consideration human beings, in which the value of science is such that it doesn't consider the importance of the individuals. So I don't know, there was a fun interview of Elon Musk, of course, in which he was caught basically showing that his self-driving cars are not that self-driving. And what he said, yeah, it was, yeah, but you cannot stop the progression of science. Here, I'm doing a favor to all of you, so please don't bother me with this trivial stuff. And okay, we can laugh about it. Of course, we saw how science, when science forgot about the human beings that were behind or for the scientific product in general, created huge, huge damages. So let's jump back to empathy. How does empathy fit in this structure? We have already an idea. We don't want an empathy that belongs either only to science or better, only to the natural aptitude, the science, idealization, or only to the human being. We would like a form of empathy that is according to this arrow, that is capable of encompassing this arrow. We don't want that the professional life is just here and the empathetic, nice human being is down there, because that creates a separation. So what is empathy? Empathy is a difficult concept because it's new. And we are still deciding what empathy refers to. We arrived at formulating the notion of empathy around 1980. With Vischer, who wrote a dissertation thesis in German in which he used empathy as Einfühlung, so the ability to feel and something in one with the other. But we started talking about empathy actually with Aristotle. If you think about the rhetoric, he used the word eleos to indicate something that is in between empathy, compassion, sympathy for centuries until this 20th century. Empathy was very much confused with these three notions. Also, you know, Coleridge, Smith, Hume, they again used empathy as this form of almost aesthetic pity, because it was almost a feeling that portrays you as similar to others. So there wasn't anything ethical or psychological in this form of empathy. It was really the ability to picture yourself like this other person. And so it was somehow even close to commiseration. In fact, some translators tended to translate the word eleos with pity, rather. But then it was with Vischer that we arrived at Einfühlung. No, here the feeling is not commiserating. Here I'm actually invested into what the other person is living. And then it was with Lips that empathy started having a psychological nuance, because this form of investment is not, you know, just a presence, just disinterested co-presence with the other. I'm feeling something for the other. And this feeling is so powerful that can create a bridge in the life of the other person. So let's start examining what this empathy is. So from the 20th century on, we had several theories divulgated around the word empathy. And here I would present basically two of them, mostly two of them. One goes in the direction of the imitation. So having empathy for someone is imitating what the other person is doing, implicitly or explicitly. For example, I don't know, there's this test to measure if a person is empathetic or not. If someone is yawning and is yawning in front of you and you yawn back, then you are empathetic. But that's the level at which the imitation theory might arrive. And so much so that they do it at the job interviews, sometimes to see if there's an empathetic person in front of them, which is the least empathetic move, because clearly the other person is stressed out during an interview and it doesn't want to yawn. But anyway, so there's this direction that leverages on the huge discovery of the mirror neurons, which certainly changed the way in which we looked at the way in which our brain works. And according to this brain structure, they believe that empathy could be defined as imitation. Now, if we look at phenomenology, empathy is defined instead more closely to that etymology, Einfühlung or Entpassing. And by the way, the word that we got today looks like Greek, but it wasn't Greek, it was an American person, Tickner, who coined the word. But anyway, so the way in which we define empathy in phenomenology is as the ability to be present in the experience of the other person. So Husserl writes in his volumes on intersubjectivity that if we separate empathy from the presence with the other person, we make empathy an ideal model. And in this idealization, we lose ourselves and the other. So Edith Stein, for example, was Husserl's student, and she was absolutely essential to indicate to Husserl the road to understand empathy. And she says, you know, when you experience empathy, it's not that you experience the same primordial feeling that the other person is experiencing. I mean, if a friend of mine comes and says, I got tenured, oh my God, I'm very happy for her. I feel that sense of happiness, but clearly I don't create a contest that she's happier. She's that sense of primordial feeling of happiness is hers. Then I can empathize, I can feel with her. So in this empathetic co-presence, there are at least 3 separated moments. There's a moment of pairing perception. I co-perceive myself with this other person. Then, in this perception, there's a reflexive revelation. I understand something about myself through this other person. I realize that I want a tenure so much, for example, or I realize that academic life is really not for me. You know, when really experiencing what the other is feeling tells you something about you. And your world is becoming bigger, because in this co-experience, in this reflexive revelation, you are creating, and here we are going towards Schultz, we are creating an I-we world, or a shared world in which there's some complicity. Now we know what we have experienced. In contemporary phenomenology, in Heidelberg, they are doing an amazing job with psychopathology and Husserl and so on. And they are labeling this term interaffectivity. I create an affective bridge with the other. And this interaffective bridge lay down the space for a new group of meanings to grow. and thrive. And when this interaffective world cannot be created because, I don't know, alexithymia, you don't experience empathy, or narcissism. Well, in alexithymia, at least you experience cognitive empathy. In narcissism, you pretend to be empathetic, but there's really nothing. You feel a heavy load of solitude, of absence of surprises in your life. So here Husserl believes that in order to bring this into our life, we need to resist to a certain form of naturalism. So we have to resist to the temptation to transform everything we live in it is what it is, in just nature as it appears. We have to resist the temptation of ignoring the intentional relationship between a subject and life world. This is the most important thing. I mean, every time I experience my body, and then the other through my body, and then a meaning that builds up because of this interconnection, a life world is created. And this life world is the compass to understand what is real in my life and how to connect with other human beings. So we need to resist the temptation of transforming science into technique. Technology is just one step of science. Here, the word techne comes from the Greek titemi. Titemi is the verb that means to do. And it's the most, basic verb, because of course, Greek, as usual, to say one thing has many, many words. To say to do, it might use the word dran, which is the verb that gives life to drum. So when I drive, when I draw, because the first person is draw, when I do something, it's charged with consequences, and I have to carefully think about what I'm doing. Or poiein, which is the Greek verb that gives the root to poiesis, creation. So I'm doing something out of nothing, I'm creating. Titemi is practical action. Titemi indicates I am doing practically something. So techne, as Heidegger will say later, is reproduction, is my ability to reproduce what I understood in the theoretical core of sciences, where theoretical comes from theorein, I mean the ability to observe and draw consequences out of my observation. So if I collapse the richness of science to technology, not only I separate science from the human being, but also I reduce science to technology, to a tool, to an instrument. And if science is what gives meaning to my life, I'm creating a science that doesn't speak to human beings, because it's a science that detached itself from what is human, because it's just based on tools, on instruments. So in doing that, Husserl points the finger against Galilei, then against Descartes, because Descartes basically transformed, here I love Descartes as well, there's a lot to say about Descartes here, and just representing Husserl's arguments. So according to Husserl, Descartes separated the nature as an object from the subject. So on the one hand, there's the res extensa, on the other, the res cogitans. On the one hand, there's the object, nature, on the other, there's the subject, the thinking mother. And those disciplines that refer to the thinking mother are humanities, philosophy, art, music, and so on. Those connected to science are, mathematics, astronomy, the real sciences. Very curious is that psychology didn't belong to the res cogitans, to the spiritual sciences. Psychology became a profession. Psychology became part of the res cogitans because Freud somehow interpreted psyche as an organ that can be studied, measured, and so on. So it's curious how the professionalization of our knowledge started separating what belonged to the nature and what belonged to the spirit. But anyway, and then according to Husserl's interpretation, we arrived to Dilthey, who distinguished all the subjects in these two blocks. So Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft. Again, science of nature and science of the spirit. And if we do that, our professional life risk to belong just to one of these two branches. So if we decide that science is a technology, that this technology has to be concrete, material, reproducible, scientific in a way that is, governed by numbers that have nothing to do with human beings, then the ethics we are going to use, it's an ethics, again, that is disconnected from my intentionality, from my meaning making, from my decisions, my instincts, and my profession too. My ability to be professional has to be distinct from that, has to be separated from that. When you take on a professional job, you are asked to be as impersonal as possible, as distant as possible from, your instinctive inner self. You are asked to live your home, live your life, leave your problems at home, because you are a professional, because you can handle this problem in a professional way, which means you know very well how to apply ethical principles, because you know very well what are the rules. You even took a training. Now we are, I don't know if it's the same here, but you take training after training every 2 weeks or so, because you need to be ethically expert about the problems that you might encounter. Then ethics becomes a set of guidelines. When I start my classes of ethics each semester, I ask, what is ethics for you? And often the answer is, find ways to not get sued, to not get in trouble with your job. Same thing with being professional. You want to be professional, you follow a certain set of ethical guidelines. You do what is expected from you according to a training. And you do that for, as we were saying before, for 90% of your time, because your job is most of your life. And then if you look, for example, at medical professions like doctors, the level of suicide is incredibly high. They cannot even start therapy sessions because that would stain their records. So their possibility to receive help as human beings and to provide help as human beings toward others is extremely low, because to be a professional is demanded from them to be as impersonal as possible. So we are inheriting a model of professionalism, of treating empathy and ethic that is highly influenced by this technologizing view of science, if you want, where we create the number, we create the token, and we forget what is behind that number, behind that token. Here, for example, I mean, it's been a while that we're talking about that, but for some reason we keep going into a tangent that is more and more damaging for us as human beings. So, for example, Emile Durkheim was writing that in the modern society, the division of labor and the social roles is made in such a way that we focus to create more wealth. So the moral order of the society, the organization of the social world is organized in such a way that we want to create more wealth, more efficacy. You are efficient. Poor doctors, I keep coming back to them. Their work is effective if they can visit 10 patients in 1 hour. And during these visits, they also have to enter information on the computer and take tests because they have to take care of the psychological well-being of their clients. Sorry, I said clients is an interesting lapsus, of their patients. And maybe they even receive the training in empathy. When they ask you, I don't know, I was recently pregnant, so I've been asked several times, are you depressed? Have you thought about taking your life? No, 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 no. Oh, that's so good. But you perceive that it's you perceive that there's a next question immediately afterwards, that you have to hurry up. So much so that I was fascinated and incredibly angry at the fact that really the appointment lasted 5 minutes, even if I had so many questions. Because the intentional relationship was such that I felt that I couldn't ask more questions. There was a structure that was completely led by being effective. And being effective is put the information on the computer, answer as fast as possible, and check that the patient doesn't want to take off her life. And okay. Anyway, so to not go on too much on this example, what also Larson noticed is that basically the Industrial Revolution created such a rapid growth, such a convincing model, that we thought, okay, we have to keep going in this direction. But in going in this direction, we subverted completely the model that we had instead with Galilei, which is curious, because when Galilei was writing, being a professional meant pro femi, meaning from, well, it's a mix of Latin and Greek, speak on behalf of whom? God, of course. Always God. So the professional was the one who had such a moral status who could lead the society toward the right direction. So the artes liberales were those disciplines who could form professionals to live a decent life, safe, morally good, and so on. And then there were the artes sordide. Well, sordide is a little dismissive, but anyway, they were the craft. So craft persons who could do things. And they were, you know, the craftsmen, craft women, no, they weren't. But, you know, craft people who would be able to create things. Now we changed completely, we turned completely the table, because now Those who can reproduce are the professionals, and they guide the moral order of the society based on a set of guidelines that are completely detached from the intentional relationship that we can create with the world. These guidelines are studied in a precise way to lower as much as possible legal problems. Again, an example from my life, every time I was going again to this checkup for the baby, I had to sign a document in which I was filling out this ethical checkup, in which I was asked if the doctor talked to me about the wealth of the baby and if it was hard to raise this baby and so on. Then I asked, but the baby is not born yet. Why are you asking me this question? It doesn't make sense. I said, no. It makes absolute sense because otherwise we get sued because we had problem with another soon-to-be mother, and so now we have to do. So every ethical concern that I was, not every, it's so much, but most of the ethical concerns I was receiving as a human being was specifically designed to have that facility not in trouble and the people working there, which I completely understand for people, but it's lonely. It's it doesn't help creating any human connection and feeling truly accompanied in one of the toughest moments of life. Imagine if a teacher would work as a real professional. I mean, the relationship with the student would be impossible to be created because you have, I don't know, I was, for example, recording a podcast with a student of mine about the meaning of life. And at some point I realized that the door was closed. I started feeling so anxious because it's a big problem to keep the door closed with a student, while you are working with them. And I realized that that moment was a wonderful moment of bonding. We were creating a philosophy podcast together and so on. But I spoiled that moment because I started remembering the ethical guideline. So what I was doing felt ethical, but in the world of professional life was incredibly unethical. I didn't tell the student, just went and opened the door. Everything went well, fortunately. So the professional today is an independent observer who look at the patient, at the client, at the other as something detached. It cannot take inspiration from its own life. It has to leave life behind, and it has to operate in the world with an ethics that is a set of guided rules. Another beautiful example that I wanted to bring in here is from the psychologist, sociologist Kurt Danziger, who brings the example of the education system. I mean, education too is so much based on technology that the tests we do and the education itself is based on how the students should score in the test. So it's not based on the intelligence of the students, on their qualities, on their abilities, and so on. Students have to adjust their mind, which is potentially infinite and can go anywhere, especially at that age. They had to fit their mind in a shoe that is this small and this shaped. It's incredible. It's shocking. Because they have to score high to certain tests, because otherwise they cannot get the job, the career they like. And we have big problems of suicides among youth, especially here. I mean, the company at UC Berkeley is closed. Santa Clara is having, I mean, it's a huge problem each semester, and we don't discuss about this problem enough. How can we be empathetic without taking for granted that the other exists independently of me, that the other is this construction that doesn't bear any question, that the student is there happy to learn, that the mother is there, I don't know, either ready to take off her life or super happy to take care of her children. We can be empathetic by being present with the other, accepting that there are human beings in this room, and there's nothing pre-given. There's an infinite rate of questions that can sparkle the reflection and meanings that can come up from this encounter. Yeah, here at some point we launched toward the criticism of Rogers, because even in psychology, we arrived at thinking, even in humanistic psychology, actually, we arrived at thinking that empathy could be a technique. Roger used in his centered approach to clients a sort way to understand the level of empathy of the client. Basically, he asked his clients to put in order a number of sentences, and according to this order, the client was scoring a certain number, and this number is, okay, you are empathetic 10, you are empathetic 5. Again, this is a heavily technologizing way of talking about something, a sparkle that can happen in a moment or not, that is oriented by life. Hence, where are we? I noticed in the book I put together that there are these two main directions. So one is this imitating idea of empathy. Which might be good when we explain a cognitive aspect of empathy. So, for example, people suffering from alexithymia. Alexithymia is that disorder in which you don't have you cannot make sense of your feelings. It's really hard. So you have feelings, but you don't have words for them. So alexithymic people can have cognitive empathy, for example, but they don't have the perceptive empathy. They cannot be there in that feeling. So in that case, it might be interesting talking about imitation. But you know, when you think of, I don't know, you are walking with somebody and you are taking each other the pace of the walk. You are not thinking, okay, now I have to imitate that guy because in this way I will look like a normal person in walking with him. If you're a psychopath, maybe you will have this thought process. But generally, when an empathetic process starts, there's this co-experiencing, this pairing coupling, and then co-experiencing a certain act. So what phenomenology is trying to do is to show that empathy is this being present with the other, even if you're right to say that I don't understand. That's empathy, because you know that you cannot really get it, but you know it. It's this is similar to what we were saying in the office. Am I being empathetic if you are talking about pregnancy and I cannot be pregnant? Yeah, because in that moment you are realizing that you cannot get, but you can be there and get closer to that experience. Or I don't know, what did I write here? Yeah, Stein, for example, insists on the co-presence of two individuals when there's an empathetic process, because often there's also the misunderstanding of experiencing empathy as I put myself in the shoe of the other. And then there's this very uncomfortable sobreposition of individuals for which, okay, one of the two goes away, which is extremely dangerous because that kind of empathy either erases the other. You know, I put myself in your shoes and I'm going to live then your emotions, and I take away the chance from you to live your emotions, which is complicated, or it creates emotional exhaustion or compassion fatigue for the person experiencing that phenomenon. So it's important, to understand how empathy is at the minimal level, really being present to the meaning of the other person as it is unfolding. What kind of ethics this leaves us with? An ethics that is strongly based on relationality, which is this word, I know my pronunciation is weird. So the ability to understand how values create ongoing relations with each other. And there's not just one direction that these values might take. Whenever I interact with another person, new meanings can generate and new values can become protagonists of the scene. And these values generally find their deep roots in my ability to be a human person, in my ability of experience feelings, emotions, and so on. So, you know, the imperative of Husserl's ethics is do your best according to the situations in which you are. In this sense, doing your best is deciding what's the best value to choose according to the situation and at your best convenience. It's harder, it's more exhausting, but in the end it is way less exhausting than living a life that is molded on a model that doesn't meet us, in pretending to meet expectations that do not resonate with our values, with our meanings, and trying to meet goals that are maybe sometimes even against our own beliefs. So that's all. I hope I said everything. Thanks for your patience. References. If any of you wants the references or something, I will mail it to you.
So